Okay, welcome to my talk. My name is Maximilian. I'm working for Eclipse Source, and my talk today is about how to build form-based UIs for EMF models. It's about EMF forms. So what is the problem we are trying to solve with that framework? In many applications you have data, and that data is being viewed or edited, at least in some part, in a form-based UI. And the idea of EMF Forms is to help you creating those forms. Those forms can be in a desktop application or they can be in a web application, and I will demonstrate both today. It can also be in a mobile application, which I will not demonstrate today, but just for completeness. The general idea that we follow is that you have a data model. In the example that we can see here, we have on the left-hand side a data model of personal data with a last name and a first name property of a certain type. And gender, for example, is an enumeration type, date of birth is an eDate type. And the idea is now that you map those properties onto a UI. So the first name might go here into a field and the last name here, and the other properties are also somehow matched. In general, not all the properties are mapped somewhere to the form. They are not in the same order that they are in the data model, but there is some kind of binding between the data model and your form-based UI. How this problem is tackled with EMF forms, as it is an EMF framework, of course, is with modeling again. So you're not only modeling your data model can be an eCore or XSD. We call that domain model. But you're also modeling your UI, and we call that a view model. So the view model will define where to display which properties from the data model. And the result of that will be a user interface with that form. And this result is being produced by a component that we refer to as renderer. So a renderer will take your data instance, your domain model, and your view model, and then render a user interface for that. How does that work in more detail? The first step and the most important concept is a so-called control. What a control defines in the view model, we have a control here, defines what you can see in the user interface in the red box on the right-hand side. So this control defines that you have some property that you want to input. Usually you have a label in front of that input field, so you know what to input there. And then you get an input field depending on the type of property. So in this case, it's a text input field because we want to display the first name. And the other thing the control does, it explicitly defines what is being displayed from the data model. That's hence data binding. So the control binds to the first name property on the left-hand side here from the data model, and it is responsible for displaying this property in the user interface at a certain place. At a certain place, what does that mean? If we look at the second important step, modeling structure with layout, that might become more clear. Because you not only want to display the properties somewhere, you will also want to define where to display those properties. So in this example, we have a structural element to define a layout called categorization. A categorization can be displayed as a tree. I specifically say can be displayed, could also be displayed as tab. And in this tree, there's a number of entries, the categories. So the categorization is rendered as the tree here on the right-hand side. And if we look at the children of that categorization, we have general information as a child, and that maps to one entry in the tree. We have dietary requirements as a child, maps to another entry. Then within the entries, if I select one of the entries, I somehow need to define what happens on the right-hand side once I select this. What is the detail pane for that? And the detail pane in this case is defined by a vertical layout. So this is just one column with one control up below another, so that in the end you get one column layout. And then only within that, within the vertical layout, we have the controls again. Sorry about that. We have the controls again that we saw before that actually define what to display there. So categorization gives you the tree, Categories give you the entries in the tree. When selecting something in the tree, this is defined here in the vertical layout, and what is actually on that detail pane is then finally defined by the control. So instead of going more into theory, I'm going to dive in the IDE right now. Most of this presentation is demo. I hope everything works, because I dared to just take the latest development version of EMF Forms, and I took Neon, of course. So the demo that I'm going to give is about a conference registration application. So for a conference registration, there's typically a lot of things you need to fill in to register for that, and you do that in Forms. So I thought it might be a good example. The registration is a central class in that data model, and it consists of 3 things: personal data, nutrition information, and payment data. And as you can see, the model is quite sparse at this point in time. I will do a second iteration to enhance that model, but to start with, we start with something simple. So personal data only has first name and last name. Nutrition information only records whether you can eat peanuts or not. And payment data only records your credit card number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to model a user interface like the one we can see here. So we will have 3 categories in that form: one for entering the general information, one for the dietary requirements, and one for the payment information. And whenever you select something here, you will get a detail form with the respective fields. So what I have here is an Eclipse Neon modeling package. And I installed the latest version of EMF Forms. In the modeling package, it already ships as part of the EMF client platform. And the first thing that I'm going to do is what you probably all have done before. Actually, how many of you are familiar with EMF? Okay, almost everybody. So promise this part won't take long, but it just shows where most of the work is. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to define an eCore modeling project. So I really start from 0 here. And I'm going to assign a name for that. And just create it. So this is going to give me the plugin with my eCore model. I won't do it with the diagram editor though, so I'll just bring up the eCore editor, and I'll bring up a special kind of eCore editor. This is an eCore editor that is actually built with EMF Forms, so we're using our own dog food. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a class. So this is the registration class. We need that. And we need a couple of more classes. So we need a class for the payment data, and for the personal data, and for the nutrition information. So personal data. And then nutrition information. And then payment data. Now we have seen on the diagram, if you remember, that we have containment relations between registration and the 3 of them. So I'm going to create those quickly. Those are all references. So put them containment, and type is obviously personal data. And another one for nutrition information. And finally for payment data. So now everything is connected up, but the model is still pretty boring because there's nothing to display really. So we will need some attributes like first name. It's an E string. and last name. Last name, I'm going to make it a little bit more interesting. Last name is a required field, so I'll set the lower bound to 1. And then to have all the different kinds of fields in nutrition information, we have peanuts, which is an e-boolean. And very finally, an integer for the payment data, the card number. Okay. Here we go. Good. Let me just check if I missed something important. Looks good. So now we're going to generate code for that. So generate the model code and the edit code. So this is the part that has nothing to do really with EMF forms. This is the part like you normally model in EMF. How difficult is it to generate a form for that now? That's now really simple, because all you have to do is you right-click the eCore model, select EMF Forms, and then create View Model Project. This will create a full-blown project with all the required dependencies and a view model. So let's do that. We'll give you a default name, it's fine. Now it will ask you to select the E-class you want to create the form for. Your data will be of a certain E-class, of a certain class, the data that you put into the form, and the data that we put into the form will be a registration. You could also create a form only for the personal data or only for the nutrition information. And I will not hit the Boolean here. It would actually even create automatically a view model for you. It will be a simple view model. It will just contain all the controls of all the data that you have in your data model. But I want to show you how to actually model that, so I won't do that. So now I have an empty view model for that. And in the view model, the first thing that you can do very simply is you can just create controls. So I can select where to create controls for the personal data in this case, and then maybe for the first name and for the last name, create controls. Okay, that's fine, but that's all very abstract. So we need a preview, and this is the preview. So you can open up a preview and see how that would render. This is then being rendered with SWT, but from an abstract point of view, it will render quite similar with other renderers for different platforms, and I'll show that later on in my presentation. And you can already also see that there's some more functionality that you maybe wouldn't have expected. Last name is in red here because it is a required field and it wasn't entered yet, and if I would correctly enter my last name, then it goes away. So it's already a functional form. And in the background, you can imagine there is a data object now, and this data object is already filled. So you can actually, from that view, even export the data that I've just entered as an XMI and maybe reload it later to test some more forms. Okay, so that was step one. What you can also do is you can also set the preview, you can refresh the preview manually or set it to auto update. So for example, if I add yet another control, maybe something from nutrition, the peanuts, then you immediately see the form updating, and it now reflects the new state of your view model. Good. If we think about our target state, we now need to somehow model that categorization. So this left-hand side with the tree. And that is called a categorization. It's an element that I can just add. So it shows something down here now. And I will add categories. I have 3 categories. And the first category is called general information. Right. And the second one was nutrition. Or it was dietary requirements, I think, in the UI. And finally, the payment data. So I directly type in the strings now that actually show in the UI. Of course, you can also internationalize that with the usual message property files. And now I want the controls not to immediately show anymore, but I want them to show whenever I select one of those tabs that now render down here. And in order to do so, I will add vertical layouts in here. So 1 vertical layout, 2 vertical layouts, and 3. So all the controls in that will just show above each other, and the peanuts. Oops, yeah, I missed the... Yeah, here we go. So now, yeah, I'll make it a little bigger. Now if you select something here, you get the respective property pane on the right-hand side. The payment data is still empty because I didn't drag something in there, but the other ones are already filled. What's also an interesting aspect now, if you think back about the validation, you can see if I delete the last name again, the validation in here triggers, but EMF Forms is now also aware that there is a validation error here, and it also flags that onto the category. So you get a lot of functionality for free in terms of validation by that. Okay, so that was iteration 1. Now for iteration 2, I enhanced the model a little bit to make it closer to a real conference. So there's more fields in here. The nutrition information I even refactored. I pulled out a class food restrictions and put in a whole lot of food restrictions, and then a diet type in here. Payment data is more realistic now, and registration has some more data. And basically I want to get this to the same UI now. No worries, I won't do that now again manually. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull in a model eCore that is already completed. Let me just save the view model, close the editors, and then so now I have a little bit of a more sophisticated eCore here. It has a lot more properties and has a number of enumeration types and whatnot. And if I now open the registration view, I'm first going to find out that the peanuts control doesn't bind properly anymore. So because it was moved to nutrition information. So I will just fix that. It's now in food restrictions in peanuts. And furthermore, I of course notice that I don't really show everything that is in the view model yet, is in the data model now, and I just want to change that. So I will generate some more controls for personal data. There's a neat little feature here where you can say show only the unreferenced attributes. So those are the only attributes that are not shown yet in the view model. So this will give me all the additional ones, and I'll add those. For the dietary requirements, I will just do the same. So there's a lot of things in the food restrictions that I don't have yet. And yeah, then there's some more in nutrition information. It's one property. And finally, in payment data there, we don't have anything yet. So we will just put in everything that we have. Okay, that was updating our view model. If we look at that in the preview now, we have everything in there now. Very quickly updated. Okay, so far everything we have done is only in the IDE. So how do I actually bring that into an application? I have prepared an application for that, and I'm going to import that now. It's an E4 application, E4 RCP application. I'm going to show it to you. It's actually a pretty simple application with only one part called sample part. If I open sample part, you can see how simple it is to integrate. We can actually step through every line even. The first line will just use EMF to create an empty registration object. This will set up as an SWT composite with some background and layout. And then this is the final call to EMF Forms, which is part of ECP, that's why the name is, and to its SWT view renderer. You get an instance of that, call to render, and you pass in two things. The first thing that you pass in is the composite, because you need to tell EMF Forms where to render to, and that composite can really be anywhere. It could be in a wizard, in a preference page, in an editor, in a normal view. And then you pass in the E-object that you want to display. This E-object can be empty, it can also already be pre-filled, and whenever you exit the form, all the data that you will have entered into the form is automatically data bound to that instance. So if someone closes the form, all the things they have filled in will be in that E-object, thanks to the data binding. And then some sophisticated error handling, of course, and that's it. So that's the whole part. And the question might now be, how does that interact with the view model now? We have created this view model project, and what this view model project creation also does is it registers the view model that we have edited with an extension point. So EMF Forms, the runtime now knows that this view model can be used to display a registration. And when you pass in that E-object of type registration, EMF Forms will notice, this is a registration, I have a view model for that, I'm going to use that. While saying that, even if you don't have a view model registered, you will still get something displayed only with that call, because EMF Forms will detect that there is no view model and will just create one on the fly. Of course, this is then a view model which just looks default, meaning it's a one-column layout with all the properties in your model. So let us just launch that product. And this will just open up this UI, and this is the UI that we had modeled before. Okay. So that was everything for a desktop application. Now for an actual web application. We have one renderer for AngularJS, which is a JavaScript framework to program single-page applications. And this renderer can display the same forms that you've modeled with EMF Forms in the web. This renderer is called JSON Forms. And JSON Forms is introducing different names because it's on a totally different technology stacks for some of the things. It can even work without EMF Forms. That's why part of the reason why we have the different names, but it's also because there's different standards. So the standard for EMF is eCore for your domain model, and for JSON Forms, we use JSON schema. That's a web standard for defining structured data, and we can transform eCore into JSON schema. The second thing is then analogous to the JSON schema, we have a UI schema. This is the counterpart of the view model. And how that works now in integration is we just have a JSON Forms exporter as part of the tooling of EMF Forms. And this exporter will create the JSON schema and the UI schema for you. And thereby you can just get web-based form with the AngularJS renderer. So I'm going to demo that now. How that works is you go to your view model and you can export that view model to JSON Forms. If you have already an Angular application, you can export into your Angular application. Basically, you export into files, and those files can get picked up by a registration. So very similar to EMF Forms. If you don't have one of those yet and you want to get started, we also offer a seed application as part of the Getting Started tutorial. And I'm just going to import that seed application. That seed application is a basic Angular application with an index HTML, which is the actual page that is being displayed. And in that Angular application, there's a folder with app.js, which is the actual executable code of that application, and a schema.js and UI schema.js, which are the schema and UI schema that is exported from the view model. So I'm going to export that. There's an entry on the view model, export to JSON Forms. Then you can decide where to export to. So I'm going to export to that folder onto schema.js. That's the eCore export, and then the view model export. I also do that in the same folder, but on UI schema.js. Override the existing ones. And to launch that web application, it's pretty simple now. I just open it with a web browser. Now I get the same form in the web browser with the same required fields. And in this case, it's rendered differently. It's rendered on 2 tabs. What you can also note, the ugly part up here is it's not a mistake or a bug. I put it in intentionally because it shows you that the data binding is immediate. So this is the actual bound JSON instance in the browser. If I hit something like peanuts true, you see that it appears here. So the data is immediately bound. That's something I couldn't really visualize well for EMF forms, but for JSON forms, that's pretty simple to do. And this is now exactly the same form that we had before. If you would like to know more about EMF forms or JSON forms, we have, I think, a quite good Getting Started tutorial for EMF forms on the website. You can also find a tutorial how to integrate with JSON forms, so the part that I've just shown you. If you're interested in JSON forms itself, it also has its own website, jasonforms.org. And of course, I will be here after the talk, so there's time to chat with me or just contact me if you have any questions. Thank you very much.